Right. Well, welcome to all of you who are joining us today for this panel discussion, and thank you for your patience in with our technical difficulties getting it up. Actually, and now, so the title here is Supporting Reentry to School for Autistic Students, a Trauma-Informed Approach. I'm Sue Keisler, Executive Director of X-Minds, which is the organization that is hosting tonight's panel discussion. For those of you who are not familiar with X-Minds, we are a volunteer-led nonprofit based in Montgomery County, Maryland, and we provide a range of resources and guidance both to families and to educators of autistic students. Our mission is to improve educational outcomes for autistic students. We have with us today a member of the X-Minds Advisory Council, Dr. Kim Pinkney-Lewis, who will serve as the moderator for our panel of mental health experts. Before I turn things over to Kim and the panelists, I want to quickly mention a few housekeeping items. First, simultaneous interpretation in Spanish is available during this presentation. If you want to hear it in Spanish, you select the interpretation button on the Zoom menu. Second, audience members, you are invited to put your comments in the chat, but if you have questions we would like you that you want the panelists to address, we'd like you to not use the chat, but instead use the Q&A box that should also be in your Zoom menu. If you're concerned about privacy, you can submit your question anonymously, and the way we're going to handle that is that you do use the chat and you address your question only to our board president, Jean Weingartner, and she will submit it to the panelists without your name attached. Third, the panelists will be taking your questions during the last half hour of the panel discussion, starting around 8:30. But you can submit your questions at any time. You don't have to wait until 8:30 to submit your questions through the Q&A. So that's it for housekeeping, and we can get going now. Kim, thanks again for being here. I will turn it over to you now.
Thank you so much, Sue. I'm really excited to be here. I hope the audio is okay. There seems to be some sort of activity going on outside with helicopters and such, so hopefully you can hear me well. I'm really enthusiastic and excited about tonight's webinar. We have some great panelists for you that are going to shed some light on what it means to be trauma-informed, what's all the hubbub about trauma. And just to give you a little background about myself, I suggested this topic to X-Minds. I'm a former board member and I'm still on their advisory board. But really, my professional work and the work that I do is in the realm of instructional design. And within design thinking, a big part of design thinking is a step or the integration of empathy within your practice, right? And so as I've learned more and more and become more and more of an empathic instructional designer and taking that type of approach, part of that is really about making sure we see who we're serving. And when we're going to see who we serve, the totality of who they are and the experiences that they bring to the table. A lot of times trauma is a part of that experience, and I wanted to get more knowledgeable about what that is, right? And so in addition to that, coming up for me as an instructional designer, also thinking about that, for my child who happens to be on the spectrum as well, and the types of traumas that they may be experiencing as they walk through life as a person of color, as well as an autistic person and the intersections therein. So clearly a very layered, nuanced topic, and that's some of what we're going to get into tonight. I am just going to share in the chat really quickly some of the resources that I have found to be helpful, some of the community spaces I found to be helpful, both from a parent perspective, as well as on the educator side. There are a couple of different Facebook groups I just put in the chat if folks want to take a look at those. But without further ado, the real show and what you're here for is the folks that we have on our panel. So I am going to just briefly introduce them in alphabetical order. I'm going to just sort of say who you are, and then I'm going to give you each the space to tell us a little bit more about your work, and then how how your work intersects with trauma-informed approaches. So first up, if we go alphabetical order, we have Alandra Anderson. She is a Montgomery County public school psychologist serving autistic students. Alandra, do you mind giving us a couple of minutes that sort of explains your work and how it intersects with trauma-informed approaches? And then I'll introduce our next panelist. Thank you so much. We're happy to have you.
Thank you, Kim. As Kim stated, my name is Alandra Anderson. I am a school psychologist. And while working as a school psychologist for the past 7 years, I've developed several professional interests. Some of those interests include the assessment and treatment of autism spectrum disorder in school-age children, the accurate identification of mental health conditions in Black and Brown students, as well as destigmatizing these diagnoses in communities of color. I've also developed an interest in historical and racial trauma and its impact on students of color academic achievement, as well as their social emotional development. My interest has propelled my professional work as well as my professional training. As Kim stated, I am a school psychologist with MCPS's Services for Students with Autism Spectrum Disorders program. And I'm so excited to be here today with you all. I'm looking forward to sharing my insight to you all in a safe space, as well as to hear and receive the insight of others. So thank you again for having me.
Thank you so much. We are more than happy to have you as well. Next up, we have Dr. Eric Rawson, who is the Director of Professional Development and Standards for the National Association of School Psychologists. Please tell us a little bit about your work.
Well, thank you so much. I was just thinking, Alandra, you must have had a long life of being first when it comes to alphabetical order. So thanks for, blazing the trail for the rest of us. So I also am a school psychologist by training. I've worked as a school psychologist in Prince George's County Public Schools. I started to really develop an interest in understanding the impact of stress and trauma on students in my work as a school psychologist, often learning about experiences that they've had in their lives, in their communities, in their homes, even at school, and realizing that some of the things we are seeing are not necessarily willful disobedience or calculated effort to make the adults' lives worse, but something that was perhaps adaptive to their experiences, and in some cases even somewhat predictable. And thinking that, I started to try to reconcile, how do I reconcile looking at a student and identifying them as having a disability without understanding the broader context within which what we're seeing is occurring, and thinking more about what are the ways that we as adults can help develop skills and nurture those skills to be adaptive and effective in every environment they're in. So I've been working at the National Association of School Psychologists for the last 11 plus years. In my spare time, I continue to read and research a lot about trauma. So that gives you a glimpse into my really exciting social life. And I'm just, I really appreciate being invited and being here. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Again, we're so happy to have you. Last but not least, we have Maxwell Schneider. They are a Brooklyn-based therapist that works with neurodiverse clients. Can you please tell us more about your work, Max?
Yeah, hi. Hi, Kim, thanks. Technology and I don't always get along. So yeah, I am living in Brooklyn right now. I am transgender and also I'm late diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder after a really long lifetime of many different diagnoses and many different symptoms and presentations with mental health stuff. And a lot of my expertise comes from my lived experience through being psychiatrically hospitalized, going through school myself with my own various types of struggles. And also I've done, I always sort of gravitated towards the world of like disability care and work. And so at a pretty young age, I worked at a camp for folks with various types of disabilities and eventually did job skills training with autistic folks and supported employment work. Before I even knew about my own diagnosis, I just knew that like we all got along real well and I seemed to work really well in those environments. But I saw a lot of ways that people were treated in those environments in a really dehumanizing way. And it was really upsetting to me. And so I came into the world of therapy as someone who historically had a lot of trouble finding a therapist who could work with some of the things going on with me without also being pathologized and dehumanized in many ways. Also, like having gone through really rigorous behavioral therapy that I also found quite dehumanizing at times. And so coming into the field, really feeling like we need more clinicians who are doing both the micro and the macro work of really trying to understand the ways that the mental health system really actually harms a lot of people, and the way that all of the systems that we're entrenched in are actually kind of all the same in that way. So trying to really understand that, and also again through the lens of trauma, living in a world that is quite traumatic. So yeah, I do all kinds of things, speaking facilitation. I put out a couple of research papers recently, and I work as a therapist. So thanks for having me here.
Thank you so much, Max. I hope that for everyone who's in attendance, you can see kind of the richness that everyone brings to the panel. And we're super excited to hear from all of you. Let's dive right into the questions, shall we? So the first couple of those is really around baselining for folks and really getting to the root of some of the definitions of some of these key terms, right? So for this first one, I'm going to come to you, Eric. What is the difference between stress and trauma? Because I think it's an interesting distinction that we need to set up as we get into the framework of trauma-informed education. Can you clarify that for us?
Sure. So generally, I think we can think about stress and trauma as existing on a broad continuum. And Kim, when you have a minute, you can certainly share that graphic. So you can see this kind of continuum here, and even within stress, right? There's different kinds of stress that we might experience. So oftentimes you might hear terms like positive stress. And this is things that we can handle, right? This might be stress over your first day at a new job, or stress about giving a presentation in front of your class, or a test coming up, or just testing some new skill. This is kind of stress that can actually be an important part of development, can lead to actually good performance in some ways. Then you have tolerable stress, and that can be something that's like more long lasting, but generally time limited and often occurring within the context of supports, maybe loss of a loved one, some major shift in some kind of routine that over time you can overcome. And then you have toxic stress. And this is all within that stress continuum. And that can be something like ongoing neglect, abuse by a caregiver at some point, and lack of adult or peer emotional support. And it is within that continuum of stress that we might see trauma emanate from. Now, trauma, as you see here, that is often defined as completely overwhelming someone's ability to cope. And actually leads to some kind of functional impact, right? Some major impact of stress where it might be impacting their relationships, appetite, ability to sleep. They might be reimagining or rethinking about something over and over to the point where it impacts their relationships, their academics, their behavior. And I think at the end here of this little graphic is where we see chronic stress, which can be really concerning, and it is probably the most alarming possible outcome, especially for developing minds. What happens when we have chronic stress, or sometimes it's called as allostatic load, is this idea of what we've learned in the research is this what they call a dose-response relationship. So if you think about stress, any stressor is like a dose of stress. And the more doses you have, the higher risk of some negative outcomes you might have, to the point where it's not necessarily the intensity of a stressor, but the quantity of stressors over time. And if they're chronic, and it's in the context of a lack of support, what you have is a stress response that is regularly activated throughout the day. And to an onlooker, to you as a caregiver or an educator, what we're seeing doesn't seem to match up with our perception of how stressful something should be. And that often can be the result of someone who has had that chronic stress response activated over and over. So again, to go back to the main question, stress and trauma are very different, right? Trauma is on a continuum, And there are some times where stress can actually be somewhat positive or tolerable. Oftentimes, in most cases, stressors do not lead to trauma.
That was a very, very rich, description and sort of laying out for us. I think some of the things that I picked up on from what you just discussed was that sort of this notion of stress over time combined with a lack of support that can sort of move us further down that continuum towards trauma. And I'll ask this of sort of all the panelists, if you want to jump in. Please let us know if you have something to add to that distinction, but also how do we feel, or how have you noticed in your work that, the COVID-19 pandemic and all of those things, has it exacerbated stress? Has it exacerbated trauma responses that you're seeing within your work? And anyone can take that first. Alandra, or Eric, or Max. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't mind hopping in. This is Max. What's been really interesting for me as a clinician is that I'm actually getting quite a few people now who actually have maybe never really experienced many mental health symptoms, who are maybe having panic attacks. And they're coming to me and they're like, what is going on? I've never experienced this before. There's nothing I can find in my life that would point to why this might be happening. And so part of the work is like kind of helping, a lot of it is like psychoeducation and like helping this person understand what it means to actually, like Eric said, be under stress for the last 2-3 years, like very consistently, and how that actually does bring up all kinds of things, even things earlier in your life that you maybe didn't think of as like a capital T trauma, but something that maybe did end up kind of living in your body long term. All of a sudden now it's being activated because you're using more and more energy to like cope with these, like Eric said, sort of doses of stress over time. And so now these things are sort of starting to surface. And I think that has been, I don't want to say a universal experience, but a very common experience. And then of course, for folks who are already struggling, I'm just seeing like an exacerbation of a lot of the symptoms that they already experience, because those are the coping skills they've been using for a long time. And those coping skills are coming out much more full force now. And that can cause a lot of frustration for people who maybe were in recovery or were sort of feeling like they were moving forward, and kind of feel like they're backsliding now. So there's also a lot of like psychoeducation around like, you're not backsliding. I promise you, like these resources you have are really, really important resources. And I know it sucks that you're using them right now, but let's try to work with them instead of against them.
That's a really great point. And I can certainly identify with some of the things that you're talking about there, Max. I'm curious, Alandra, in the school setting, have you seen, additional stresses or trauma responses in the school setting for kiddos, for teachers, for parents? What's that been looking like? I'm sure it's been interesting.
I think it's been impacting everyone that you just mentioned, the students, the teachers, administrators, because just like Eric said, the quantity of the stressors for families. So whether it's been economic impact for families, whether they've been losing a job, losing their home, and then having to deal with virtual learning for parents during the whole year, 18 months we were doing virtual learning. I think those things have exacerbated for students in the school setting. We're seeing some more behaviors. Typically, they're having to get used to getting back in the school setting. Like for instance, when you're at home in virtual learning, you can just get up and go to the bathroom. But now when you're in school setting, we have to remember to sit in our chair and then ask to go to the restroom, make sure that everyone knows where you're going. So just getting back into the norms of things have been a challenge for some students. But I think we're working hard to make sure that we're meeting these students' needs as much as we can.
And I'd love to jump in on that question too. And I think in tying in the first question you asked, right? I think one thing that's often neglected when we're talking about trauma is that it is not defined by an event always, right? So kind of like Max was talking about, this kind of like this low-grade chronic stress that's existing over time. It is defined by the individual's response and reaction to their experiences. And I think that's really hard for us as adults sometimes. It's not our job to tell kids what they should be stressed about. It's only our job to be responsive to it. And I think I reflect on my own role as a parent sometimes, how many times I've, they lose their mind over like losing a sprinkle on their ice cream cone, right? And my initial response as a tired, overwhelmed parent is like, it's no big deal, right? You have 150 more. But again, me saying that is not helpful. And anyone who's been on the receiving end of that kind of comment knows it's not very helpful too. And so different people will experience different stressors and have very different reactions to that. And there are many things that impact that, but it's really the individual's appraisal of what's happening around them that impacts it, not some researcher who says this is a stressor and now everyone's going to be traumatized by it. And I think we should be thoughtful in the terminology we use. And when it comes to the impact of COVID, you know, I think we have to think about how we heal from collective stressors, things like solidarity, predictability, developing meaning and purpose from the experience. And for many, those ingredients are lacking here. We know many individuals are at increased risk of stressors, right? Child maltreatment, when if they're home with families, or family members that perhaps are experiencing hardships on their own, increased substance abuse or financial insecurity. So the list goes on. I do think that there is reason to be hopeful, however, because a lot of our students and our children and our youth do show a great deal of resilience, and there's a lot of reasons for that, but they're often a lot more adaptable than we give them credit for as well.
Some great points there, Eric. I might say that I feel both seen in what you described of the parent's role, right, and slightly personally attacked, but that's a different story. But I think that was a really great nugget, right? That it's about the trauma is about the individual and how they sort of experience and respond to it. It's not up to somebody else to say, oh yeah, you have a right to feel traumatized about this. It's about that sort of individual. So thank you for that nugget. I think that, so now that we've got some of these basic definitions down, the next phase of this is to frame out what trauma-informed education or trauma-informed services are and what they look like. So I know we have talked about, Eric, we sort of sent around this graphic that I'm happy to share if you want to speak to it, but really also looking for everyone else to chime in as well. So this was the 4 R's of trauma-informed care that you shared, if you want to talk about that.
Sure, and I certainly look forward to not monopolizing this conversation because I know Alandra and Max have a lot of wonderful things to say. But this is kind of SAMHSA's broad definition of trauma-informed care, and you know they tried to be cute and use alliteration, and I appreciate that. So we have the 4 R's here. And if you can think about the first 2 as kind of where we've been for the last decade, right? Realizing the impact, recognizing the signs and symptoms of it, being basically a broad awareness. I think where we need to go now and where the kind of the rubber hits the road and why we're here is how do we respond to it? Now, what do we do about it? What does it look like? How do I know if I'm trauma informed? What makes you more trauma informed than me? And how do we measure that? And then this last part is this idea of resisting re-traumatization, or how are we preventing it? And I think for those of us that work in systems like schools, we need to think about what are the ways that how us as schools are potentially causing stress, right? Maybe we're neglecting issues within our discipline policies. So, for example, so I think trauma-informed education is not a program, right? So there's nothing to sell here and there's nothing to buy here. It's a framework that really guides our interactions with children, students, and each other. It's a mindset and an understanding that gets brought into the behaviors and the actions and the policies that we use. And a lot of the literature is that is really a broad systems level focus. And there is a component of treating individuals, but is really thinking about what are the systems that are in place and how are we addressing that, right? So how do we improve our discipline policies? How are we engaging caregivers? How are we focused on building relationships? How are we building up social emotional skills of both the staff and caregivers and the students and children? How do we there's some research now looking at even the built environment, like is there greenery? Like Max is surrounded by greenery, right? I love that. Think about the lighting and the temperature and all these other pieces. And You know, can you see the outside through windows? We're even looking at things like structural racism or disproportionality or the absence of LGBTQ topics in sex education, right? That can be, many times we don't think about that as being traumatizing, but that can lead to trauma for some, or unaddressed peer violence. So it's a broad framework, but it's a mindset shift at its core. And you might have heard what's wrong with you to what happened to you as a mindset shift, or what not what's wrong with you, but what happened to you and what resources and tools do you have at your disposal? What assets can you readily access? So yeah, I've been rambling. Thanks for attending my TED Talk there. I'll turn it over to Max and Alandra.
Love that. Max or Alandra, you can jump in if you'd like, please. But how does this sort of show up in your work? Like, what is your approach to either trauma-informed education or trauma-informed therapeutic services? What does that look like?
I think in the school setting, it's built in. A lot of those components are built in to our school system. We try hard to make sure that we're culturally responsive, which Eric just talked about a lot about doing those things. I think that is very important, making sure that we meet the needs of various cultures that are in our school system. Also, building those relationships with students is key. I also believe in that. And then being resilient. So learning factors to help students become more resilient too.
Awesome, thank you. And Max, for you.
Yeah, thanks. Personally, I really lean into disability justice movements and organizing and anti-racism movements and organizing to think about what it means to be trauma-informed, because frankly, I think those movements do it the best. I think those communities do it the best, like definitely my disability justice community and the folks that I organize with, we talk a lot about what it means to just like be attuned, what it means to just like really think about people in the context not only of their individual lives, but also, again, these systems that Eric is talking about and the ways that different aspects of these systems show up in people's lives in ways that can be very, very traumatic. Jean just shared an article that I absolutely love. I recommend like everyone read it all the time, called Radical Disability Politics, and a bunch of really great organizers work on this article. And so for me, actually, a lot of the work I do with my clients, because most all of them are neurodivergent, whether on the spectrum or they have ADHD, and most all of my clients also identify with some level of disability. We work a lot actually on externalizing what has been internalized, rather than looking at, we're not trying to fix anything. We're trying to accept the whole person as they are, work on accepting all of those parts of that person. And then we're also looking at like, what are the messages that you internalize about who you're supposed to be in the world, and where can we point at the systems around you and say, no, actually that came from there. And then also, how can we help you find and build community? Because I don't think that trauma-informed care means that I sit in a room with a client and we expect that they're going to feel better. I think it also means we talk about community, and like Eric said, like solidarity, right? So for most of my clients, I'm like, you need to get into a group. If you don't have a group, we're going to find you one. Who are your friends? Let's figure out who your care team is. Like, let's start naming those people. That's really important work, I think, because those are also external resources that protect against trauma in the future and re-traumatization. That was a little rambly too. Thank you.
It was all good stuff. Did you want to jump back in, Eric?
Well, first of all, that wasn't rambly at all. I love that. I completely agree with everything Max just said and what Alandra said. I mean, I think along those lines, a lot of when we think about being trauma informed too is just as an adult that's or as any individual that's interacting with others, we are aware of the potential impact of trauma, and we are appreciating the fact that we can't always place the burden on other individuals to tell us that. And so we are applying this kind of broad, compassionate approach to all those we work with, but especially those we know that have histories of stress and trauma. I think one thing, as a psychologist, I often say, but it's helped me as an individual, is the mantra is like, it affects me, but it's not about me. And that can free you up sometimes as an individual to say, well, someone's cursing at me or someone's did something, but this is not about me right now. right? They're not giving me a hard time, they're having a hard time. And it's some of those simple mindset shifts that can really transform and free you up from feeling you have to defend yourself to applying compassion to someone else.
Yes, so many nuggets within this discussion. I want to just foot stomp as well. I appreciate the discussion of the sort of the systems approach to this. I'm very informed by sort of systems thinking and systems processing, because I think part of why it was important for us to have this webinar now. Why are we talking about trauma-informed anything now when it's always relevant, right? But I think all of the systems that we've talked about, right? School systems, family systems, economic systems, all of these systems that we've been talking about have really been stressed to nth degrees in this time. And so I really think these mindset shifts that we're talking about, right? Shifting from, are they having, are they giving me a hard time versus they're having a hard time? Those things are really, really key right now. So hopefully everyone has a sense of why we felt like, or I felt like it was really important for us to have this conversation. So thank you for that. I want to get into some of the nuances, and how do we recognize trauma, right? A trauma response. What does that look like? How do we recognize that in children and our students, right? Does it show up in different ways for people? Can it show up in different ways? If we're talking in particular about is there a neurotypical trauma response versus a neurodiverse response? Sort of what does that look like? And I know especially Max, that you work with lots of your clients are neurodivergent. What does that look like for you? How do you notice that?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Kim. I think before we jump into like how the trauma shows up in autistic and neurodivergent communities, I actually think it's really important to first just like set some groundwork around like autistic and neurodivergent trauma, right? So research and community conversation in the last decade or so, and actually especially in the last few years, has really begun to show us that autistic people not only express like post-traumatic symptoms a bit differently, but also experience trauma itself a bit differently from neurotypical people. And it's definitely been suggested in some research that I've read that there are a broader range of circumstances that can feel traumatic to neurodivergent folks. So again, kind of like Eric said, and maybe this is because of the way that sensory input and different types of input can feel much more intense to autistic folks. The way that autistic folks experience things in the world might be a bit more traumatic than it would be for perhaps a neurotypical person, perhaps. There are also these constant sort of little t traumas or microaggressions and like interpersonal and structural barriers that neurodivergent folks are faced with, right, on a daily basis in a very ableist society. And so of course that contributes to like a much more treacherous landscape in general. And that's that sort of ongoing chronic stress, because every day there's going to be something that a neurodivergent person is probably running into that isn't really designed for them. Not to mention like it's actually hard to find competent mental health providers to actually like help you navigate that. So there's kind of all of these pieces that aren't really quite coming together for a lot of neurodivergent folks. And I'm also not sure of any type of like trauma recovery programming that's been developed specifically for neurodivergent body minds. Like I only really know about trauma programs that are kind of focused on like neurotypical people. So that's like another thing. Like I went through a really intense eating disorder program. I was a neurodivergent kid. It honestly like didn't really work. It kind of just made things worse for me. And we didn't like, that was a problem. Like there needs to be eating disorder programs, right? For like so many autistic people have eating disorders. But we don't have any programming to like support them in like getting healthier. So there's like that whole kind of piece, right? And so specifically to the neurodivergent community in terms of what I've mostly witnessed, it's kind of similar to what I've said before, where like personally I've found that a lot of people just experience like an increase in like frequency or intensity of symptoms that they already experience. But also occasionally there can be new things that are picked up. Again, whether it's like, I worked with an autistic adolescent who was going through a lot of really intense trauma at home and then also COVID and was really isolated from community and like developed an eating disorder. Because all of a sudden, all the sensory input they were getting from elsewhere that they otherwise could manage and handle, it's like now food was just like one more sensory thing that they at that point just did not have the energy to try to like work through. So it wasn't even really about wanting to restrict. They were having real sensory problems with food. And this was a really new symptom for them. So we had to get really creative with how do we help you take care of yourself enough so that these new symptoms that are also popping up are not like completely destabilizing your life and your ability to get through your day.
Right. I think
Yeah.
it's a really great point that you raise. I think part of what, as caretakers, we're concerned about is that sort of, if we're a caretaker, our kiddos, if it's yourself, like just moving through the world and in a world that's sort of not created sort of for you, and that so much of it, right, can be this oppressive sensory input that could be in and of itself without supports over time leading to trauma, right? I'm curious about, recognizing trauma within school systems or, within the school setting. Have we seen anything like that coming up, Alandra, within the school settings or things like that?
I think in kind of when Max was talking about sensory input, I also want to think about routines, like a change in routine for students may be difficult. Like, for example, I have a student that I was working with one day, and he was in the classroom and he started engaging in hair pulling behaviors, like trying to pull out his hair, and then just heighten. And then being that I had a relationship with the parents, so I kind of knew him about his background. He had a deaf in the family, he had to move. So he had all these experiences. And although he didn't necessarily have the words to articulate what was going on, his actions were describing what was going on with him. So I think sometimes we see maybe demonstrating behaviorally in students, especially the ones that may not have the words to do so all the time.
That's a great point. So this next question may or may not be personally driven, may or may not, but so sometimes, right, we notice differences in students holding it together during the school day, right?
Right.
And then coming home perhaps and having a meltdown, and perhaps now more now than previously. In the work that you all do, is that typical? Or is that something that, that's expected? Is that one of the ways that these responses show up, where, individuals are sort of holding it together during the day and then letting it all hang out when they come home to dear old mom or dad or whoever is there to sort of greet them? Inquiring minds want to know.
Yes, I've definitely seen and I've heard that. And I've also heard the opposite, where at school they may be kind of refined, but then at home it's like, woo, or the opposite of that, where at school they're very all out, and then at home they're kind of together. So I think it also kind of signals to us, maybe where's the trauma at? Is there trauma occurring in the home setting? Is the trauma occurring in the community or in the school? Like, for example, sometimes at the end of the day, like I like to use the example of kindergarten because I think that's such a good group. They're so fun. But at the end of the day, sometimes we may see a kindergarten who's just very heightened and just not wanting to get on the bus, like tantruming and things of that nature. And then we're wondering, maybe what's going on? Why is this kid not wanting to get on the bus? Is there something that's going on in the home setting, or there's something going on home on the way to the bus, in the community, the walk home? So yes, I've definitely seen that in my experiences in the school setting.
Thank you. Eric, you're muted.
Yep. It's going to happen sooner or later. Sorry. So I think that's a really interesting thing, and I think in the literature we're learning a lot that individuals with trauma histories often have difficulties with self-regulatory skills, right, and self-regulation. I mean, we know many people who lack self-regulation. If you've ever seen road rage, right, that's self-regulatory weakness, right? So it happens to all of us. But I think what we know about self-regulation is that it is like a muscle. So I always say this example about if I put a warm cookie in front of you and you were like, I'm not going to eat that cookie, right? The effort of not eating that cookie creates cognitive traffic, and that experience, what we know, two things from that. One, over time, you will probably end up eating the cookie, right? Because it is a finite resource, self-regulation and cognitive control. The second part is that as you're doing that, you are taking away the ability to engage in other cognitive tasks, right? So there's cognitive traffic going on. And so it's quite possible that by the time afternoon hits or by the end of the day, that self-regulatory capacity has been completely diminished. And oftentimes school is a self-regulation, haven. We're asking students to be regulated every moment of the day. So it is not surprising to see that, especially individuals with a history of stress.
Thank you so much for that. I do want to start talking and shifting us a bit, because I think we've laid the groundwork for what stress is versus trauma. We've laid the groundwork for some of the ways and in some of the settings that we're seeing some of these responses come out, perhaps now more than before. But I also think it's important to sort of frame for our audience, what are some of the solutions and approaches, right? So if we're recognizing these things, how can we sort of approach solutions to this? One of the things that we had wanted to know, in particular, since XMind serves Montgomery County Public sort of Schools area, is, what are some of the ways that Montgomery County Public Schools is sort of, addressing this? Is there an awareness of trauma and trauma-informed approaches? Are there interventions that are in place? Are they being implemented? Sort of where are things within the landscape of Montgomery County Public Schools?
I'm assuming that's for me, right, Kim?
You got it.
All right. So with Montgomery County Schools, being that we're such a large district, and I love that, and we have several resources, I think that we are definitely in the implementation of trauma-informed practices. We do a lot of things for that. So for instance, in the pandemic, when the pandemic started, we developed student well-being teams. And what student well-being teams is a team of educators. So it's the school psychologist, the school counselor, the admin, maybe even a teacher. And on these teams, we're working to problem solve for students' needs. So for instance, students may have had difficulty accessing virtual learning, so we may be providing technical support. Students may have difficulty with resources in the community, such as housing or jobs for their families. So we were connecting families with resources. And it was just a way to problem solve for the families and students. And the success of it has continued, and we're continuing to implement the student well-being teams this school year as well, to kind of make sure that we're still meeting the students' needs. Also, every year, teachers participate in trauma-informed practices training during the summer professional development. And I thought Eric was going to talk a little bit about this, but we also do training on ACEs, so adverse childhood experiences. That's something we do a lot of training on as well. And also before the pandemic, actually when the students came back from the pandemic in the fall of 2020, we did what we call psychoeducational lessons. Max talked a little bit about that, but all students received this. And what we talked about in the psychoeducational lessons involved COVID-19, like how the school would look like when coming back, what PPE would be utilized, even talking about how interactions would change. So instead of being able to give your friend a high five, you might have to do an air five or air bump. And we also talked a lot about racism and how it's impacting us, because we were on a race reckoning during that time as well. So we're providing psychoeducational lessons throughout, from kids from our CAP and our pre-K programs all the way to our 12th graders. We're receiving psychoeducational lessons at their levels. We also do Signs of Suicide, which is a prevention program for suicide. And it's from grades 6 through 12. And what it does is help students identify a difference between sadness and depression, and then also identifying symptoms maybe in a peer and being able to tell. So they use the acronym ACT, so Acknowledge, Care, Tell. And that's something that's being implemented in the school setting. We also do restorative justice practices, which is a sort of like a conflict resolution process, but it's been able to help students come to realizing the outcome and being able to be more calm and when having to deal with the conflict. So being able to have a conversation with someone in a calm manner to resolve conflicts and taking responsibility for those things. And we're also implementing mindfulness. Sometimes you're going to a school, I go to several different schools, and something that you'll see in the morning when you get there, they're having a mindfulness moment, or they're doing mindfulness practices throughout the day. So we're implementing a lot of different things. I know I just shared a lot of information, but also we can put in the chat, a link to the chat for the Office of Student Support and Engagement, where it details a lot of the things that we're doing in MCPS to become trauma-informed and our trauma-informed practices as well.
Well, Alandra, that's amazing. You did share a lot of really, really great sort of programs and implementations that are currently, being accessed within the school district. I'm just curious. So if the student well-being sort of teams,
right.
If a student already has an IEP, is that sort of embedded within their IEP team? Can it be different individuals that are helping to support that student? What does that often look like if a kiddo, has already been identified for other services?
Good question. So even if a student is identified with IEP, the concerns can still be brought to the student wellbeing team. I'm a psychologist that works with a specialized program, and I'm on a team at all the schools that I support. So I'm able to kind of connect with the students that way because I have a relationship with them. So for instance, if a parent or a teacher brought a concern about a student, I know that student, so I can kind of relay resources to the team, and that can be shared with his parent and or the school team or the special educator, the speech therapist, whoever needs to be involved. So it's access to all students.
Awesome. And I also appreciate that you sort of brought in the multi-layered, the intersectionality, right, of sort of students with various needs, also sort of race sort of as a confounding factor on top of that. I think that's really important for us all we're all reckoning with that right now. So thank you for that.
Correct.
Eric, in your practice and in your work, what are some best practices that you would say? And then of course, Max, I'll come to you as well. But what are some of the best practices in terms of solutions and approaches that you utilize or find to be beneficial when taking a trauma-informed approach with your clients or folks you've worked with?
Well, this is the $1 million question, isn't it? Right? What does trauma-informed look like? So first, I think it's important to remember that it is more of a framework and an approach than something that will look the same from place to place, right? The whole phrase of if you've seen one school, you've seen one school. I think if we think broadly, that means we are thinking, well, how are we thinking about the drills we take, right? Are we doing armed assailant drills? Are we being mindful about the impacts of that on certain students with stress, with trauma histories, right? Or students with autism that are in the school? Or are we mapping triggers in the school building? I've heard of one school that realized the bells at the high school were really jarring between classes. So they changed that to play music instead of bells. And they actually built it into a positive behavior system where certain students could choose from pre-selected songs. And it's like almost like hearing your song on the jukebox. I'm aging myself a little bit, but but how are we applying it to our discipline practices? How are we thinking about ways that we're engaging families and the experience of attending an IEP team meeting, for example? I remember working with a school where we shared information. They started sharing information about who will be at the meeting. We gave pictures and names and roles, and we thought about the seating and how we're interacting with them during the meeting and engaging families, because we know stress is contagious. And if kids are stressed, usually their families are stressed. And then there's the other pieces about just how we interact with others, or how are we empowering people? How are we applying unconditional positive regard? This concept of there's a no strings attached contract that no matter what you do, I hold you in high regard as an individual. I don't necessarily have to approve of a particular action, but I always approve of you. And I always want what's best for you. Or how are we thinking about how we're maintaining high expectations for everyone we're working with, when many times our expectations are lowered, that we hear an individual has a disability or they've experienced some stress, and we think we're actually being helpful by lowering our expectations. We can have high expectations and still apply compassion and flexibility. And there's a nuanced difference there, but it's a really important one. Prioritizing relationships, consistency and predictability, potent mood stabilizers, consistency and predictability. When things change, our moods change. And then one thing we haven't spoken about yet, it's always tacked on in the end, but it's still very important, is focusing on our own well-being as caregivers. And I will go on a brief piece on that. I think I've attended many things on self-care. I stink at yoga. I can barely touch my knees. And I don't love it. And I think there's mindfulness and things like that. But I think for many, self-care often feels like another thing to do. And it's important that we tap into the resources around us and think about how organizations can support us rather than simply saying, well, you got to do this on your own, and not think about how we're setting appropriate boundaries and things of that nature.
Great, great options and things to consider and reminders for me. So thanks, Max.
Yeah, thanks. I think a lot of what both Eric and Alandra shared ring true for me. I think there's like these kind of core tenets of how I approach being trauma informed in my practice. And when another piece of the work I do is I consult with schools also around like their inclusive education practices. And we're always talking around about consent, transparency, being whole person centered, engaging choice, offering empowerment, flexibility, containment, and like Eric said, like follow through, being consistent. I think like, you know, let's just think for a moment about like what trauma is. It's something that like your brain and body can literally not make sense of because you did not expect it. It was something that is like beyond your ability to sort of cope and understand. And so having something that's predictable, having something that is consistent, like again, like Eric said, that's so important. And consent is also very important because a lot of times trauma is happening against someone's will. Like these traumatic events are not something someone asked for. I cannot stand some of the aspects around certain ways that children are treated in like mental care treatment centers and the way that they're not given the opportunity to like consent to the things that are happening around them. Kids, the way that they make decisions might need to look different than adults, but it is still important for them to be able to make decisions where they feel like they have a sense of agency and autonomy around themselves, whether it's talking about the preference they have in a classroom, whether it's giving them an opportunity to do this or that for an assignment based on their interest, right? Like choice, I think, can also be a really powerful antidote when it's guided with care and when it's appropriate.
Really, really great point. Really great point there. I think we've gotten some nuggets around in a sort of a care setting, what that means for especially for you all as panelists and your expertise in your practice. Some of the things to look out for in the school setting, right? Mapping triggers through the school as an example of that. On the caretaker side or for parents, do any of you have recommendations for parents and how they can approach being trauma informed with their kiddos as we're all dealing with our own and heightened stressors, our own potential traumas and all of those things, and noticing that in our kids? What are some things we can be doing in our homes to help out our kiddos?
I can hop in. This is a hard one. I think a lot of parents don't always like my answer, but like you need to handle your stuff. You know, I think modeling that like consistency and like modeling dependability as a parent, being a secure container for your child is like so important. And I've worked with a lot of adolescents who are on the spectrum and also who are like trans and just like have a lot going on, who's 9 times out of 10, it's like the parent that I need to be talking to because the kid knows who they are, they know what they want, they know what works for them and what doesn't. And a lot of what we end up talking about is how much friction they rub up against when they're trying to just like be okay day to day. And the people around them are trying to get them to fit into small boxes that don't work for them. And a lot of times that's just like what's coming up for like the parent or the adult around the student, who a lot of times it's fear. Like when I talk with people, like, so I work with a couple of school districts who have folks who are like educators of inclusion and they kind of work with all the teachers. The number one thing we always name that comes up for teachers that can sometimes harm students is fear. It's like fear that like, I'm not good enough. I don't know what to do in this instance. I don't have an answer. And it's like, you don't have to have an answer. You just have to hold space and like not react super strongly to what you're experiencing from your kiddo, because that's modeling to them that something that they're doing isn't okay. And that they don't have a safe place to go where they can be dysregulated.
Yeah, no, that's great. Go ahead. I think Eric, I saw you want to jump in, so go ahead.
Yeah, so a few things pop in my mind. I mean, one is, I don't know if you've ever heard of the hot-cold empathy gap, or anyone listening in. So it's basically this idea that we have 2 states of emotion. We have like our hot state of emotion where we're driven by emotion at the time. And then there's the cold where we're rational. And, it's think about like, don't go to the grocery store when you're hungry. So you can be kind of cold and make good choices versus going to the grocery store hungry. It's this idea that there's an empathy gap where when you're in a cold state, you're unable to even understand yourself when you're going to be in a hot state, and vice versa. And so I think many times we're in a place where we have rational conversations with children and youth or adolescents, right? And then they get in a hot state and we say to them, what happened? We had a plan. And the response is, I don't know. What research shows is that they're telling the truth. That happens to adults. It happens a lot in addiction or smoking behavior, where we say, if I'm gonna go to the bar today, I'm gonna have one beer, just one beer, right? Well, 8 beers later, right, whatever, you're like, what happened? Why did I do that? So I think realizing that, again, they're not out to get you all the time. I think there's a lot of, Bruce Perry put out these 3 R's of regulate, relate, and reason. So when something happens, it's important to help regulate first, relate and connect, and then you can reason. So if everyone is in a heightened state, you as a caregiver or the child or both, is not a good time to start rationalizing and reasoning and planning, right? Make sure everyone has been regulated and has an opportunity to connect before you start thinking about consequences, teaching lessons, talking it through, processing. I think we want to identify what are the skills and resources that we need as adults. We all have weaknesses and things we can build upon. And also, what are the skills and resources that our children have? And I think about skills and resources as different things. Like a skill is the ability to develop and maintain friendships. A resource is friendships that you have. So that's just an example. And then lastly, it's okay to apologize. I think kids stink at apologizing. Adults are worse at apologizing. I don't really know many adults that are very good at apologizing, but it can be very, very powerful to say, I'm still learning, I'm doing my best. I snapped at you before, and I'm really sorry. I want you to know I love you and appreciate you, and I'm doing, I want to be the best parent I can to you.
Really great, solid advice. Thank you so much for that. Alandra, if you have something to add, I'll let you do that. We have a number of really, really great questions in Q&A. So before I get to those, if you want to jump in, let me know.
Can never find that mute button. You can go ahead with the questions. I think everyone hit on great things. And I don't know if we mentioned self-care for parents too, because I know that's really hard, especially during this time, but self-care is so important also in the home environment.
Yes, I can echo that it's hard, but also so very important. So thank you for that reminder too. Okay, so first question that's up. Have any of you used acceptance commitment therapy, ACT, when addressing trauma-informed practices?
I have
Have
not.
not.
I mean, I've heard it. Yeah. I mean, I've heard or I've seen some things at some point that it can certainly be a useful tool, but I haven't used it.
Okay, thank you. So the next one is, how do you handle recursive circular trauma that is perceived to originate from previous mental health care or services itself, such that there's resistance to seeking new treatment or even watching this very program right now? This is not just stigma, and the word stigma itself sort of a gaslighting to the issue. So it sounds like, so someone who has been, how do we handle or deal with someone who has been in, mental health care or other services programs, and that has become traumatizing to the point that then it's generalized to sort of all things in that space, right?
Yeah. This is something I can speak to because it's actually an area of specialty of mine. I very specifically actually get a lot of clients who are like, I have been harmed by the system. I'm trying to re-engage in therapy. I'm skeptical. And I'm like, yes, rightfully so. That's just fine. Let's start there. But I get a lot of that. And I think part of it is because of how I describe myself as a clinician. This to me, again, comes down to like consent. It's like, and I don't know if this person is asking like, how do I handle this in someone else who I would think needs that care, or how do I handle it in myself? I think if it's about handling it in someone else, quote unquote, you don't. that person is, it's not going to work if you force them to go. It's not going to work. So I would actually recommend looking into peer counseling. Like peer work can be really empowering and really special, and a nice way to bridge that gap. Also potentially just looking into like clinicians with lived experience who can sort of speak to some of that in a more transparent way. That could be a way to bridge that gap. If it's for yourself, I think it's about, you know, finding a way where you have enough supports to try to engage in that, and also identifying what is going to work with you and a therapist and what isn't going to work with you, so that you can really discern whether a relationship feels like it has potential to help you move forward in your life.
That's a good point. I'm curious about the sort of peer-to-peer work. What are things that folks should look for in a peer though? Like, what is that? I assume that there's got to be some sort of, you know, barometers or things that you want to make sure are in place, right?
Yeah, so when I say peer counseling, what I'm actually talking about is not just like, oh, my friend down the street, which that can actually also be very powerful. But there are actually what are called like peer support, like people essentially. So people who go and they get trained, and actually New York State, where I'm at, is really incredible and offers free peer support training. So through the state, you can take these courses and you get a certification, and then you work under the training of another peer support specialist, and you get your like peer support certification. So there are people that do offer those services as kind of like independent practitioners. There are also some organizations you can go to who offer peer counseling type work. Organizations like Project Let's, for instance, I think they have like a peer hotline. So that can be a really nice way where it's, you're not talking to like the clinician, which oftentimes represents like the person who enacted harm, right? You're going to be talking to someone who kind of comes from your place of understanding a little bit differently. And that can be really powerful.
Absolutely. Absolutely. The next question, how do you handle misdiagnosis leading to harmful treatment, which is then labeled as non-compliance? I wonder if perhaps there's, this is getting at sort of with misdiagnosis, right? That can be associated with trauma. If you know, like, oh, I don't identify with that diagnosis, and maybe the treatment, meaning like the sort of interventions that are put in place, not sort of serving the individual because there's a misalignment between the actual diagnosis and the one that was given, and then the treatment that's given to that. I think this question is bringing up, right, that can be trauma inducing, you know, potentially, but other thoughts about that? Something to chew on. We can mull on that one. And if we want to come back to it, we can. How about that? How about that?
This feels really like systemic for me, you know, like this
Yeah.
is kind of about like, how are we diagnosing people? Like, why is misdiagnosis happening in the first place? You
Sure.
know, and again, it's like, are you talking about for you or for someone else? I think like there's a lot to unpack there. And so that to me feels a little bit more like a discussion than like a question that has an easy answer.
Yeah,
For sure.
I mean,
Yeah.
I think when you're thinking about, if you're talking about children and youth in the public school system, right, that they're, you know, special education services, which is the primary mechanism for identifying disabilities. The IDA, the Individual with Disabilities Education Act, does not mention trauma at all in the law, other than when talking about infants and toddlers. So there's this challenge now where a trauma history alone would not qualify you for special education services. And there's a lot of confusion, and there's some case law I'd be happy to share where there is inconsistent application of, well, then do we talk about trauma in the IEP if they qualify for a different disability? Do we include it in the report? And so when it comes to the diagnosis and that driving interventions and strategies and supports in schools, there are challenges there within the confines of the laws that we work within.
Right. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, but I think you're right in that that's sort of a systemic thing. There's a lot within this notion of, within the initial question around sort of misdiagnosis, there's something systemically going on within that that needs to be unpacked and could perhaps be another webinar in and of itself. So this next one is sort of school focused and sort of specific, but so how to approach adolescent school refusal in a trauma informed way. What would that look like? Or what are some tips you might give. This is in reference to a particular adolescent that's considered twice exceptional / in the Asperger range. For context.
I think when we're thinking about school refusal, again, those questions about the mindset shifts of what is not necessarily what is wrong with you, but what's happening to you and what's going on. Why is the student wanting to refuse school? Is there something going on in the classroom setting? Is there something going on in the school building? Is there a history of something going on in these settings that we may not be aware of? And that's just so important of the relationship building and the onset of the school year. And even before then, as students enter school, just building those relationships and getting an understanding of what may be going on in a student's life. I know within our program, we like to do, with an autism program, we like to do what we call an intake every year during the summer to get more information about the student, like getting more background information. And then one of the questions that we ask is, has there been any significant changes with the child within the past year or two? And that really sets the frame to kind of understand what's going on with the student and how can we support the student as they're coming into school. So that's some ways that I think could help with understanding and approaching this student.
Yeah, and I would,
Absolutely.
the only thing I might add is, and again, going back to some things we talked about before, like how can we create opportunities for empowerment, right?
Mm-hmm.
And Max talked about this too, but, if we're thinking about it in a trauma-informed way, we know that trauma is, essentially violates our locus of control in many ways. How can we empower them? And I think we want to avoid any component of shame associated with the anxiety of having phobia of school and shaming individuals or trying to shame individuals into, not being afraid. That doesn't work.
Yeah, I second that. So Max put in the chat, how has shame not come up yet, right? But it's true. It's one of those sort of things that does typically come up when you talk about trauma, because then people, especially generationally, right? Some folks haven't been given permission to even talk about some of those things. And so that's an important aspect too. So for Alandra, there are a lot of questions about, can we see these curricular material? Parents were very energized by your sort of list of the different interventions that are being put in place in Montgomery County Public Schools and expressing interest in sort of getting more information about those things. So is that possible? I know that we put in the chat a resource on the website, but is that fully accessible to parents or what does that look like?
Yes, on the website, it details a lot of the things that I've talked about today and more. So that way parents can be able to see that. When they ask about circular materials, for instance, we just adopted a new social emotional learning curriculum called A Leader in Me. And it's being implemented, being that our county is so big, we have several schools we're implementing in stages. So once a group of schools are getting it this year, implementing this year, and then as we go on, more and more schools will be added to it. But when it was going through the pilot of like determining if this is a good one, parents had the opportunity to view those as well. And then we also do several trainings where parents can get more information about that. And that is linked onto that website as well. So parents can get access to see kind of what the program entails and things of that nature. Is there any other questions? I saw that question.
Yeah, there's a couple of others, but there's one that I want to, and I'll go through them sort of each
Okay.
in order, but I did want to hit this one because we are sort of short on time.
Okay.
But so this question is around sort of ABA, it's particular. So I've heard many autistic adults talk about how ABA had a traumatic impact on them. How can I tell from the outside? I think this is from like a caregiver perspective. If an autistic student may be suffering due to past or current ABA, and how as an educator can I help them? So this is actually an educator trying to get a sense of how to recognize trauma. And we can take ABA or not, but if you're doing an intervention, how can you tell if it's having a traumatic effect? I think is really the root of the problem or the root of the question.
How can we determine if a student, if the student has autism, are we determining, is this person wanting to know if the student has autism? How do we determine trauma in the student has autism?
Yeah, so
Or
this is an educator that's stating that they have heard many autistic adults talk about how ABA, so the intervention of ABA, applied behavior
Mhm.
analysis, has had a traumatic impact on them as an autistic person. And they want to know how they can tell from the outside if one of their own autistic students may be suffering due to past or current trauma. Now, the question is really around the ABA intervention. However, I think there's a number of you can sort of swap out whatever we're going
Okay.
to call the intervention, right? Like, how do we notice if an intervention that we're using or has been used on a student who is autistic, if they're suffering from trauma, and how can we address that?
So,
Oh, go ahead.
I'm sorry, Alandra, did you want to take that one?
Go ahead, Eric.
All right. I don't know if it's possible to always tell that. I mean, just like any experience of trauma, many times people are not aware of it and they can't articulate it. It comes back as a reaction, not necessarily a memory. And it is not their burden to always tell you everything. Tell us as educators, everything that's happened. So I think like anything else, it's certainly possible that ABA, I can see why it might have a negative impact, right? Because it assumes that you can but won't in some cases. So like anything else as an educator, if we're trying an intervention, we should be monitoring its effect and its progress. And if it's not working, we adapt that intervention. And I think we should be looking out for adverse reactions. But I think one of the challenges too with trauma is that the symptoms can look very different from person to person. So it's not like, oh, they reacted this way, they must have had a history of trauma as a result. So it's tough to some degree. You have to use your instincts, which often are probably better than you think.
And then as an educator, we're in the school setting. So you have access to people like me, a school psychologist or a school counselor that you can consult with. And we can work together to determine, is there anything that we're seeing that may be traumatic for the student? And we can problem solve together, because I think it may be student specific and we probably need to work together as a team. So reach out to maybe your school counselor, your school psychologist, or even someone at the school that may be able to help. I think that will be helpful too, just to have more heads thinking at it, more problem solving with it.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's great advice. So as I did mention, there are a couple of specific sort of MCPS questions. So one, Alandra, does MCPS have a peer support program?
Montgomery County is very large, so I'm not 100% sure about everything that MCPS does or every school does, but I know that there are programs within the school, for instance, with mentoring between a teacher and a student. And there's also like peer buddies. Like one of my favorite things that I've seen in one of the schools called like a Best Buddy program is supporting some of our students who have some cognitive disabilities, and which maybe a peer who's maybe in 4th grade may work with the 2nd grader and like do social skills activities and things of that nature. So there are specific ones in specific schools. So we may need to go to your school and see what your school is doing, but there are several that are being done. And my favorite is Best Buddies. I love that program. I've seen it at so many different schools across the county.
Awesome. Yeah, I've heard that one too. It's a good one.
I love it. It's like my favorite thing to see them like on Fridays doing little fun activities together. It's great.
Yeah, when done well. Yeah.
Yeah.
So does MCPS offer DBT as a school-based program? And I'm not sure what that spells out to be. So if someone put that question in, if you want to put that in the chat.
I believe dialectical behavior therapy. Is that correct? I'm assuming.
Hopefully that's what they're asking. Yeah. So if that's it, does MCPS have that or offer that?
No, but we do offer mindfulness, what I just talked about, and that's a component of it. So we do offer mindfulness, but I don't believe there's a specific program. From my experience, it's a specific DBT program and MCPS, but there's components of it offered throughout the county.
Perfect. Okay. Okay. So what can the community do if specific mental health content in school is concerning for legitimate non-political reasons? Is there an appeal process so that someone with common sense can formally vet these issues without having a PhD. I understand the struggle in general with some content when it comes to schools, but so if there's mental health content in school setting and folks are concerned about it, what's the course of action that they can take? I'm assuming reach out to their team and their schools.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You took the words out of my mouth, Kim, right? Reach out to your school-based teams and determine, have the discussion with them and voice your concerns with your school-based team, and hopefully they can resolve it.
That actually takes care of 2 questions in the chat, or in the Q&A. Everyone has done a great job of describing the continuum of trauma, but one thing I'm struggling with is how does one approach with nonverbal students who also have been assessed and found to have cognitive disabilities? How does one know when the child's behavior is trauma-induced versus environmentally maintained? Lots going on in that question.
Mm-hmm.
I can
Go ahead,
comment on
Max.
that for a moment. Yeah. I mean, I think this is, again, the thing that's so hard about some of these questions is like, it just brings up more questions for me, right? Like, wow, what is the student like? I mean, how do they behave in class? Like what are some of the things that you experience from the student? What is the environment like for them? Do you know anything about their history? There's so many kind of what ifs that it's really difficult to give a really specific answer to this. And I think this is partially where like attunement comes in, but also like kind of trying to unpack ableism a little bit too, like both inside of the school and inside of whoever is kind of trying to work with that student. Because I think one of the biggest things that the disability community talks about is like presumption of competence. And a lot of times with folks who have been sort of labeled as having a developmental disability, and especially folks who have been labeled as having some sort of other type of cognitive disability, there's often a presumption that that person is not competent or can't tell you things or can't communicate with you, and it's just not true. They communicate in all kinds of different ways. They just don't use words. So really, again, being attuned and trying to really pay attention and know that student is so important, because they're telling you things constantly. You just have to know how to translate. And that sometimes means maybe asking the family for some support as well. Yeah.
Max,
Thanks, Alandra.
great job. Yes,
Yeah.
everything. I'm just like, yay.
Oh, no, I know. Snaps.
Yes,
I mean,
snaps.
I think my reaction to this question too was, how do you know if it's trauma-induced or environmentally maintained? You probably won't. It could be both. And I think that is one of our biggest challenges. And the data around doing trauma screening is actually not very good and does not support it. Which is really why, going back to what is trauma informed as a framework, and that it is system focused and guides our interactions with everyone around us, is because we can't just wait for someone to tell us that they've experienced trauma and then say, oh, okay, now I'm going to treat them this way. In many cases, it's multiple things. I've been in meetings where like, well, is it ADHD or trauma? I'm like, I'm not sure that's a knot we can untie. And I'm not sure it matters, right? We're seeing a constellation of behaviors, and we know as much history as we can and what works for them, and we know their strengths, and we're going to build off of that. And saying, well, this came first and this is secondary is a false dichotomy, and it's a trap.
Excellent. So you guys have all taken us on this journey and helping us sort of, demystify what we're talking about when we say trauma informed, establish why it's important, and given us some key nuggets to look out for. And as we close, I want to just give you all, if there's anything else you wanted to sort of impart on our audience to do so, I'll give you like sort of, last call. If there's anything else you'd like to share before I turn it back over to the X Minds organizers to close us out. And we can go in alphabetical order, if that makes sense, since that's how we did the intros, I guess. So Alandra, anything else you'd like to leave us with for parting words?
One day I'm going to master finding that mute button. It's been 18 months, but I still cannot find that mute button. Oh my gosh. But I think being trauma informed has been able to help people like in different communities. Like we didn't necessarily get to touch base a lot about communities of color and how it may be able, how trauma may show up in those communities. But I think if we're thinking about things of that nature, like we're more aware now. Opportunities like this give us that awareness. Yes, this is a starting point, but I think it's starting so much more for us to be informed about how we interact with each other, how we interact with in the community, in the school setting. So I think this is just a great opportunity for us to be more trauma informed and have that education and that awareness.
Thank you for that.
Mhm.
All right, Eric. You're next.
So I'm going to lean on something my grandma always told me. She said, pain shared is halved, joy shared is doubled. And it was something that always has resonated with me. And I think a foundational element of our work is relationships and trust. And the idea that, you know, when we experience pain, if we're surrounded by good people, it absorbs that. And being around, having good relationships just accentuates our joy. So I'll end with that.
Thank you. And thanks to your grandma for that advice.
I mean, I don't
Max,
know if she made that
yes.
up, but she said it to me all the time. So, you know,
We'll take
I
it.
quote her.
We'll attribute it to her. Max, any final words?
Honestly, just that, like, just by having these conversations and showing up to these spaces, like folks are like doing the work, you know? And I think like just by thinking about this and grappling with it and wanting to understand, like that's such a big step forward. And so frankly, I'm just glad that folks are here and like grappling with this and are invested in the youth of today, wanting to make sure that folks are growing up in a healthy way, and that we're all getting through this pandemic together. So I'm just very grateful to be here and very grateful for everyone that attended tonight. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. And I am very grateful for each of you for giving of your time and your expertise to help us better understand all things trauma and trauma informed. And with that, I will turn it back over to Sue.
Thanks. Well, I just want to thank you, all you panelists, Eric, Alandra, Max, and our wonderful moderator, Kim, for an amazing discussion. I am so glad that we were able to record it because I'm going to just go and like listen to it all a second time. I feel there's so much in there, as you know, lots of great takeaways, and I think I'm just glad that we have it recorded. And for anybody in the audience who someone who could really benefit from listening to this, I'm going to be sending out an email with the link to the recordings in Spanish and in English, as well as links to a lot of resources that our panelists have given us. And so look out in the next couple of days for an email from me, which will have all that in it. And please pass on the links to the recordings to anybody you know that would benefit from it. I also want to invite everyone in the audience to join us. Our next presentation will be in January, and we will be hosting Julia Bascom, who's the executive director of the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, also known as ASAN. And she's going to be doing a presentation on the topic of disability is not a dirty word, which is, if you've never heard Julia Bascom speak, it is just a treat. She is a fantastic presenter, and I really recommend you join us in January. I also just want to invite everyone in our audience to complete our quick 2-question feedback form. And you can access it through the QR code on the screen, and we'll get back to the screen. We'll leave that screen up for a while so that you can get to it. And also the link to the feedback form is also in the chat. I'm hoping if we can stick with that screen there so that people can do it. So we'll just leave that up for you. And really, we very much appreciate anyone's feedback. People at X-Minds really do pay attention to those feedback surveys, and we really appreciate just taking a quick minute to complete it. So thank you to everyone for joining us tonight. Thanks again to our panelists and to Kim, our moderator. So everybody have a great night. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.